So just 2 minutes past now. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Canadian Hydro Association and our partners at Fasken, Deloitte, the Canadian Propane Association, and the Canadian Steel Producers Association. My name is Nicholas Solero, Vice President of Operations at the Canadian Hydro Association. And I am pleased to be speaking to you today from Vancouver, BC, which is the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. If we could move to the next slide there, Turn. Thank you. For those of you who may not be familiar with the CHA, we are the national association that's represented the hydro sector here in Canada for the last 50 years in collaboration with our regional affiliates in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. We support the ecosystem with advocacy, government relations, communications, networking, and events. We represent just over 200 Canadian companies, academia, consultancies, research agencies, and end users who are developing, demonstrating, and deploying hydrogen and hydro technologies in Canada. If your organization is interested in becoming a member of our association, please do feel free to reach out to us after this webinar. Just some housekeeping rules, folks, before I introduce our moderator and speakers. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and conducted in accordance with the CHA's competition law compliance policy. So we kindly request attendees to refrain from discussing any confidential or sensitive business information. Feel free to enter any questions that you may have for our speakers in the chat section here, the Q&A section here on Teams, and we'll be sure to get to them during the Q&A segment following the presentations, where you'll also be able to turn on your microphones and cameras as well. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and speakers for today's webinar. Firstly, our moderator, Dan Brock, is a partner at Fasken, where he also serves as chair of the Government Relations and Strategy Practice and co-lead of the firm's Hydrogen Energy Advisory Team. Previously, Dan has held senior advisory positions with federal ministers of environment, justice, finance, and has worked as principal secretary to the leader of the official opposition. Next, with our panelists, starting with Alex Steinhaus. Alex is senior counsel in Fasken's Montreal office, where he practices in the areas of government relations, political law, Indigenous legal matters, and intellectual property. Next, we have Lisa Zyko, partner at Deloitte Canada, who holds 27 years of experience in indirect tax, specializing in customs and global trade services and other indirect taxes. She is recognized as an indirect tax leader by International Tax Review since 2016 and was a past recipient of the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters Member of the Year Award. Shannon Watt is the president and CEO of the Canadian Propane Association, leading corporate strategies and operational management with extensive experience in sustainability, advocacy, and public policy. Shannon guides the propane industry through regulatory challenges and growth opportunities. Last but not least, we have David Bilodeau, who is the Vice President of Climate and Environment at the Canadian Steel Producers Association, specializing in advocacy, communications, government relations, and policy development. And with that, I'll officially pass it off to our moderator of the day, Dan Brock of Fasken. Dan, over to you, please.
Thanks, Nicholas, and welcome, everybody. It's great to be here. So the disruptions of this trade war have started. They're being felt north of the border, south of the border, and truly internationally. In fact, as we were preparing to come on for this webinar, we were getting updates sort of coming in by the minute. So it's a very fluid and rapidly changing situations. We may have updates throughout the webinar on some meetings that may or may not have happened today, but the impacts on the economy in Canada are real. They're being felt across basically all sectors. How long and how deep the pain gets in Canada, and I would argue, and I think the Canadian government's been arguing in the United States, remains to be seen. It's unclear at this point. Companies in across sectors across the economy, we're seeing this throughout practice groups in our law firm. Companies are figuring out how to grappling with how to manage this and how to sustain their businesses and protect their businesses as the tariff war really takes root. For the hydrogen sector, what I refer to as kind of still the nascent Canadian hydrogen sector, and by that I mean, hydrogen technologies developed and deployed in a commercial and consumer way. It's still a relatively nascent industry with all sorts of opportunity and potential for growth and aspirations for growth, but it's still relatively nascent. And the impacts on a new industry like this, one that does rely so heavily on this global public imperative to decarbonize the economy, is being impacted directly. So we thought it would be interesting to have a conversation, and if you could turn the slide, Tony, if you can, next slide. We thought we'd explore some of these themes to discuss where we are, where we think we're going, and to touch base with some of the sectors in the Canadian economy where the disruptions are being felt, and where these are industries that have a connection to and an interest in hydrogen generally. So the way we've structured the webinar here is we're going to begin with a presentation by my colleague Alex Steinhaus, with me chirping from the sidelines. We do this in other settings, and I can't help myself, so I'll probably be poking in during his presentation. So we'll speak and kind of level set where we are right now with the tariff and trade war between Canada and the United States. And then we'll bring in our other panelists, Lisa, Shannon, and David. And for that, we'll talk on the screen here as sort of topics 2 through 4. We will cover these in a broader discussion with the entire panel, including Alex. And we'll conclude with a sort of a discussion about where things are at, the impacts, the relevance of the federal election in Canada, what we're expecting in the days and weeks to come in terms of the trade war, and what lasting impacts, if any, if we're fearing the trade war will have on the global imperative to decarbonize, and the knock-on effects to industries that are really relying on that imperative remaining strong. So we're going to do that. So welcome to panelists and all, and I'm going to pass it over to you, Alex, now to start your presentation.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us virtually today. We were joking before this began that we need a little stock ticker to keep up with today's developments, as the Prime Minister has suspended his campaign to return to Ottawa to convene a meeting of his Canada-US committee to grapple with the latest round of tariffs, which is auto tariffs. And we'll get to that in a moment. So if I'm looking distracted, it's because I'm trying to give you the most up-to-date information as I speak. Dan and I have been doing this for a little bit as we're trying to understand this better, and I want to give us a little humble brag of, we have our very own landing page on the Fasken website, of a Trump Administration 2.0 landing page, which Dan and I podcast, we blog about this, and we really delve into how Canada has been responding to this existential threat. We can go to the next slide and begin my little presentation if possible. So as Dan said, we're going to level set a little bit. One way we'll level set is just try to unpack how different Trump Administration 2.0 is from 1.0. And it's sort of think through a couple of points that illustrate this. The 4 years where the president, said he won but had lost, and Biden was in power, he had a lot of time to think through how a future term would be a lot more efficient, a lot less disarray and palace intrigue, and they really, really hit the ground running. So to put things in perspective, this administration was long ready and roaring to go on executive actions. So instead of using a congressional process, legislative process that requires both houses and, the difficulty of horse trading to get legislation through, they proceeded by way of executive action. And the numbers on this are incredible. So through the first 4 years of Trump in 1.0, he had 220 executive orders. In the first month of Trump 2.0, there were 75. to date, as of yesterday, and I haven't checked today if there are any additional ones outside of our space here, but he's already done 90. Already within his first month, he had done more than any president in 80 years. Over the Biden administration, he had done 162. So 90 to 162 in what, 60 days, just to give you a sense. Executive orders can obviously be undone, but they're just very quick to do. The president signs it, as we've all become accustomed to these ceremonies, and anything can go. In terms of the brooding over the 4 years out of office, they also learned that they just need to get quick confirmations. So they had their roster aligned from day one. They knew who was going to which position, and they had them ready. And the Senate has been confirming people at a very, very quick rate, which allowed people to get the experience and to get forward on their mandates to enact the MAGA agenda. That's been another thing. And then, frankly, very critical piece to all of this has just been flooding the zone. And I'm sure most of you have heard this expression being bandied about, but it's a Steve Bannon expression. And the idea being that you just absolutely overwhelm the Democratic establishment and any media just through flooding the zone. You throw everything, and some things will get a lot of attention and eventually fall by the wayside, but that's okay. All this other stuff has snuck through. So the zone has been flooded, and they have been doing that exceptionally well if you support the agenda, because a lot of the stuff is getting through. What's clear on the trade agenda is the president has been self-described feeling emboldened to enact an unabashed protectionist economic agenda, and you can sort of see it through these quick confirmations, flooding the zones, and the executive actions. So another difference between Trump 1 and 2.
Alex, can I just interrupt you? Are you moving to the other slides, or are you staying on the slide?
Gonna stay there for a little bit, just talk a bit about how Trump 1 and 2 differs vis-a-vis Canada. So Trump has come forward, obviously everyone following this, of being very critical about what he's described as a very porous border between Canada and the US, which has governed a lot of the early days and months of both the post-election and his inauguration. But really, there's a lot more access to growing to Canada than just that. He has mentioned a serious problem with Canada's Digital Services Tax, with Canada's dairy industry in terms of its supply management, with our inability to hit the NATO spending target of 2% or even up to 5%, as Trump has suggested. He's long griped about auto sector imbalances. I mean, we've heard him on just about everything, including unfairness to American banks. The former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was caught hot-mic'd and then later affirmed it in media interviews that he actually believes that the president's annexation threats are quite serious, that there's a larger goal here with his Trump administration to take Canadian critical minerals, water, of course, as the largest source of clean water, fresh water, I should say, as well as our oil and gas, and potash, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also, you could really see in the early days of this administration a tremendous passion of hating on our former prime minister, calling him governor. It was really speaking to a MAGA base that had really grown tired of a prime minister, and speaking in some parts to a very receptive audience in Party Canada who are looking for a change in government. And this was so successful that it happened. So now we have a new prime minister in Canada, and the dynamics we'll see. I've been trying to do this stock ticker approach to this presentation to see whether Prime Minister Carney has indeed successfully spoken to President Trump today, as he has suggested he might. If anyone has most recent news, as I've been speaking, but as of 2:30, he had not. We can go to trade-related executive orders. So rather than go through this list of dates,
so Tony, can you move this slide forward to
oh, perfect.
Yes, that slide or the next one.
I'm ready to go to the next one. I apologize.
The next one, yeah, it's okay. Next one. There we
go. So trade-related executive orders so far. Rather than go through the list, and I mean, I have it here if people have a few hours to revisit the greatest hits, but I think where we're at is tariffs have been raised. Canada has responded. Tariffs have been walked back. Tariffs have been re-raised. Canada has responded. They have been slightly walked back. I can bring us perhaps to today. So CUSMA compliant goods have been exempted for the next little while. What that means in practice, we can delve into throughout the course of this presentation. And we have an incredible tax specialist with us who can delve into that. But what I'm following today and tomorrow and next week is really on this auto tariff. So yesterday announced a huge rupture in the history of North American trade relations with imposing tariffs of 25% on non-American made autos and some parts. And the details of this are quite hard to follow. And we'll see what it means. It looks like it'll be some sort of ramp up from 2.5% onward. Where this gets incredibly complicated is, as you're all addicted to whatever news source you're getting on this stuff, it looks like the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, where a lot of our auto sector is principally based, had convened with his Commerce Secretary counterpart this morning, where rumors are suggesting that the Commerce Secretary has said, please do not retaliate on this thing because we might stand down for Ontario. So that's where we are. I'm waiting on the stock ticker on this. Prime Minister Carney has obviously suspended his campaign, as I've said a couple of times now, to return to Ottawa to convene his Super Canada, U.S. and National Security Committee of all the senior federal ministers to grapple with this. We're waiting to hear what comes out, whether retaliation is coming forward on it. But that's sort of the story that we have. Auto sector manufacturers today are trying to impart to Ottawa not to impose counter tariffs immediately, outside of sort of the other retaliations we've been following, seeing if there'll be a lockdown. That's it for this slide. We can go to the next one. So as we grapple with this, and you have to picture the dates of, like, you go from January 20th, when a Canadian reporter asked Trump, he had promised tariffs on Canada, what's going on? And he suggested February 1st, right? And thus began this odyssey that we've been through. Canada's been trying to do a very measured response. There's been a Team Canada response in many ways of trying to convene all the provinces. The joys of a federation have never been more apparent, but trying to get provinces as disparate as Newfoundland and Alberta to see eye to eye in a common approach on this stuff, which has had measured success and relative difficulties. Canada responded where the puck was moving. So border was an issue. Canada responded $1.3 billion. There's beautiful shock and awe footage of our new fancy Black Hawk helicopters who are patrolling parts of the border. CBC reports suggest they have not probably done very much, but it was all in the hopes of convincing folks that we're taking border seriously. The statistics on this don't replicate the existential crisis the Trump administration has suggested, so kind of hard to do that. I've listed here export taxes. Now, we had a mini experience with this. Premier Doug Ford did a surcharge for a couple of days, you will recall, on Ontario's hydroelectric exports to 3 states in particular. It led to a very strong reaction, and Premier Ford has backed off. Premier Carney is suggesting that it's certainly open to using this sort of as a trump card, sorry, lame joke, to kind of level set. But obviously any sort of incendiary measure like that, we have to brace for the worst. So it's probably one of those last cards to use, so to speak. I mentioned here bailouts. I mean, happy to answer questions on that. Parliament.
Well, that's and Alex, on the on the remedial work that the federal government would be doing. Like, so that's going to be a situation where industries are going to be engaging directly with the government, and it's hard to know what that will look like exactly, but I suspect it will probably bear some resemblance. If indeed the tariff war is long and deep and the economic impacts are as serious as we're worried they might be, it'll be a little bit like COVID. It'll be a COVID style, I think, bailout for workers in particular, but also for really stressed industries. We know from talking to senior people in Ottawa that it's hard to overstate the seriousness of the threat to our economy. And it's really difficult. You don't want to scaremonger, but it's really, so the senior officials in Ottawa and the government, the current government, and no doubt a future government, it's like we're going to have to take drastic measures to safeguard the economy if this thing gets as bad as it might. And so but stay tuned for how that will actually play out.
And another iterative point to Dan's point is just exemptions from the list. So Canada has imposed about 60 billion, 25% on 60 billion of US goods to date. There's a list circulating. You can find it. I can share it with you on the Government of Canada website for us, the response to what we're getting to April 2nd, which is about 125 billion in US goods. There's a list you can comment on before a final decision is made, but there's a whole process to seek a remission from that list for products. So that's another way where the government's going to have to be very, very engaged.
Alex, can I ask
And
you what are the prospects that the CUSMA negotiations will be moved up? I think people have been sort of handicapping that maybe all this trade action gets sort of swooped up into the review and renegotiation, presumably of the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement. Is that something that is likely to happen, or what are we hearing?
so it's been another thread to follow in this one, and it's a bit hard to follow. I mean, at the very, very beginning, Canada was suggesting an early renegotiation and kind of saying to Mexico, "Ciao," or any other, or probably a Spanish word would have been a better use of that. But it's now moved along. Quebec Premier François Legault had suggested an early renegotiation is absolutely the right roadmap. Ontario's Premier Ford has suggested the same. Ottawa seemingly was more open to it. Of late, you hear from Ottawa, if the rules of the road today can't be followed, what's the point of renegotiating something else? So I think we're kind of in that space. The earliest any party can walk out of CUSMA. The earliest, though, the joint review is to take place is June 2026. And we'll look to see whether that gets preempted in some way. But if an agreement is supposed to provide certainty and there's such flux and uncertainty now, I can understand why Prime Minister Carney is suggesting let's level set here and make sure we know what the rules of the road are.
So having interjected in your presentation, I now have to tell you you have 2 minutes to complete.
So let's jump to what the two campaigns have said about the two federal campaigns have said about hydrogen and sort of what President Trump has said. So Prime Minister Carney obviously went through a leadership race in which you can still consult his website, and he actually does speak about hydrogen and other clean energy sites. He does specifically say he wants to invest in hydrogen. So we can expect a positive development for the actual industry. Whether this is more concrete than under Trudeau remains to be seen. We can import from Fasken that one of our colleagues in our London office was at the roundtable when he was in London on, I guess, day 4 of his prime ministership. And he did specifically highlight to some of the biggest businesses in the UK that Canada's open for business on hydrogen. So we thought that was a very interesting takeaway. Obviously, last Friday, if you caught it, he made a campaign announcement of sorts suggesting that he's going to remove all interprovincial trade barriers, create an energy corridor, do one project, one review permitting system, so accept a provincial one. These are major things that might have downstream effects on the hydrogen industry in Canada, should Prime Minister Carney get reelected, I guess, after his week. There's a series of other things, but I can sort of gloss over. In comparator, the opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, sorry, I'm just trying to pull it up, has not specifically mentioned hydrogen or other clean energy sources, but obviously there's been a lot of focus on oil and gas. AXA tax has been strong. Removing it on industry has been a big part of his campaign. Streamlining projects. He came out last week for the Ring of Fire, suggesting all permits will be done within 6 months, which I suspect there will be some Indigenous opposition to in a variety of different realms. That's sort of it. And maybe I'll touch very briefly on Trump with my last -6 seconds. Also very hard to follow. Future is quite uncertain. Politico is reporting that Trump had frozen a bipartisan infrastructure act and Inflation Reduction Act spending to the tune of $369 billion in clean energy products under Biden. Politico is reporting yesterday, a newspaper close to the Beltway in Washington, that they're looking to freeze 4 Democratic hydrogen hubs and retain 3 Republican ones. I think we could see a future where Republican states or those who voted for Trump are rewarded with projects that are good for their industries, and those leaning Democratic might suffer the consequences. So I apologize for running late, but that's
no, that's fine. And the next slide, Turney, if you put the next slide on, I think what we'll do, Alex, is let's come back to these issues, because we come back with the whole panel when we discuss it a little bit later about where we are and where we're going. So next slide, Turney. And sort of with this, let's our patient panelists, let's bring them into the discussion. So Lisa and Shannon and David, let's get you in on the discussion. So Lisa, I'll start with you. So we've kind of level set at the high level on the political dynamics of the trade and tariff war, but I think it would be helpful for the audience and for everybody. It's always good to level set on what it is we're actually dealing with here. I mean, at the basic level. So what are tariffs? How do they work? And what is actually happening at the border in the Canada-US situation?
Sure. Yes, thanks for the question. So tariffs at the most basic level, they're also referred to as customs duties, basically levies imposed on goods imported into a country by the importing country administration. If we take it down to very basics, normal, quote unquote, normal tariffs are for WTO member countries, World Trade Organization member countries. We have, since the Uruguay round of negotiations, sort of come to a principle of generally lowering tariffs and setting sort of maximum limits on tariffs. And so generally those tariffs are often referred to as most favored nation tariffs. So the rates of those are, let's say, relatively lower or have been declining over the years on most goods, and particularly again amongst the developed nations. So we have the regular tariff that is applied to imported goods into a country, and that tariff, the rate for that tariff is determined based on how that particular good crossing the border is classified under a tariff schedule. So there's a tariff schedule covering more than 8,800 tariff items or numbers that covers every good that could be imported into a country. So that tariff classification, we call it, under the schedule, is what drives the rate, along with the country of origin and whether any free trade agreement may apply with respect to those goods. That is how the rate for a normal tariff is determined. It's applied against the customs value, which we also have a WTO agreement on how to harmonize and standardize principles around how to value products into a country. Not always a sale occurs. A tariff would still apply on a good moving across a border. And then when you don't have a sale, generally you have other methods to determine how those goods are valued. So that is the normal regime. As Alex mentioned at the outset, under the Trump administration, there are what we call supplemental tariffs being imposed under, so these are not your normal tariffs, these are under prescribed or specified statutes in the US, some of which pertain to things like national security, which is what we see the steel and aluminum and the automobile tariffs now under. Some are unfair trade practices, which is what we see the Chinese tariffs levied under the first Trump administration and then increased under Biden and further increased under second Trump administration. Then we have the IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, under which President Trump imposed tariffs on Canada that went into effect on March 4th for border security related issues. And that particular statute, the IEEPA, is the least structured in terms of the parameters that need to be followed. Basically, you had to declare a national emergency.
So Lisa, and correct me if I'm wrong. So globally, tariffs have been coming down.
Yes.
And with the effect of integrating economies, integrating supply chains, the world is becoming more integrated, not less.
Yes.
These American tariffs get slapped on. This is a reversal of that trend, a dramatic reversal of that trend, and with the largest economy in the world. What is, I mean, we kind of know it's painful, but for Canadian businesses that actually have operations in the US, so operations in both countries, or that are integrated with supply chains across both countries, what are the obvious the biggest impacts on them of this this sort of quick reversal of the direction of tariffs?
Yes, and I mean, so many impacts in the sense that since the original NAFTA agreement in the 90s, especially amongst the NAFTA countries, there's been a lot of effort to sort of optimize supply chains and production across the three countries, and so there's a highly integrated, economies between the three. So and many have enjoyed little or no tariffs either under the MFN regime I discussed or the free trade agreement. And so now when we start imposing tariffs, and not only tariffs, but stackable tariffs, multiple tariffs that may apply multiple times throughout the chain, and then we start introducing restrictions on how to like get some of those back. So when a good crosses a border multiple times, there's often mechanisms that would alleviate or remove the effect of one of those tariffs, like duty drawback, a refund on exported goods. But even there, the US has shut that down and said no duty drawback. So there is risk of multiple times a tariff, the same tariff applying, also stacking of different tariffs. So the costs associated with that are astronomical. And early days when we started talking to clients, I mean, we put out sort of a point of view at Deloitte, taking a holistic approach to supply chain and tax and trade planning, but looking at it really through the lens of business archetypes and whether the impact to you is going to be different, whether you're a Canadian company selling into the US market, or you're a US company buying into the US market, or you have operations across multiple or both countries where you have maybe more flexibility in how you shift and deal with production and sourcing and supply chain.
And does it impact the intercompany movement of products and goods? And does it also cover services or not?
So on the intercompany, that's an interesting point because actually a lot of this, it does impact intercompany movements. And what I'll say is a lot of the short-term planning that companies are undertaking to mitigate the effects of the tariff, if picture you're a Canadian company and you're selling into a third party and you're declaring a value based on that third party price, a lot of the planning is actually, well, maybe for tax and tariff planning purposes, it makes more sense to impose an intermediary transaction, an intercompany sale in between that, if we structure appropriately, will allow us to use that as the base for customs value. And there's a lot of planning going on right now, either to impose intercompany transactions or to re-examine existing intercompany transactions with a view to lowering the base upon which the duty is applied. Because in a non-tariff scenario, we might have just charged sort of a full product price without stripping out things that may not be dutiable, intangibles or services, which brings me to your second question on services. Strictly speaking, services and intangible property are not in their own right subject to tariffs, but they can become dutiable when connected to the movement of a physical good across the border. So I mentioned at the outset that there's WTO valuation rules. Those rules have certain, in situations where we're selling a good, it's generally going to be the selling price of the good. But then there's additions and deductions from that. So for example, a common one would be product engineering or design and development work undertaken outside of the country of import. If that's not in the selling price, it is a separate add back into the customs value that needs to find its way in. Conversely, if you have a selling price that includes post-import construction, erection, or assembly services, those things can be deducted from the import or the selling price to come up with customs value. So the answer on services and intangibles, because royalties can be caught, is it depends, but there should be a link to a physical good moving across the border.
Okay, let me bring in the most patient Shannon and David. So this will be a panel discussion, but we have some things to cover to sort of set the groundwork for this. Well, and so we have with Shannon with the propane sector in Canada and David with the steel sector in Canada. These are mature sectors, mature industries. They are very international. There's integration between the market with Canada and the world, and in particular the United States. But let's talk a little bit about this. Shannon, when I think about the propane industry, it's gaseous low carbon fuel, and one value proposition for hydrogen is to be that as well, gaseous low carbon fuel. The propane industry knows how to move and work with gaseous fuels. You're a mature market, customers. Tell for the webinar, explain a little bit more about the propane sector in Canada, and in particular the relationship between the Canadian industry and the U.S. market.
Sure. So propane, I mean, it's in everybody's backyard. I'm not allowed to say the word barbecue, but you can guess what it is. So we're everywhere. We're coast to coast to coast. So in terms of that transportation infrastructure, similar to hydrogen, we're a fuel that you want to use anywhere you can. Most people think of us as residential, but that's actually only 10% of our market. We're very much in the oil and gas and mining industry. We're used in agriculture, we're used in transportation. It's actually really a versatile fuel. And I think the same as hydrogen, right? It's a fuel that's intended to be very versatile and used wherever needed. So we make, I think, 98% of our propane in Canada. About half of that is exported And of that half, about 60% goes to the US. And so these trade tariffs actually have an implication for us. What's interesting about propane is that those that use propane residentially in the US, so they use Canadian propane, they tend to be rural Americans that are actually Trump supporters. And so that 10% tariff has a direct impact on Trump supporters. And I think is part of the reason why energy got 10, well, one of many reasons why energy got 10 and not 25%, because it's an important constituent. But the proximity to the border and getting that Canadian propane to those customers, it's easier to go across the border than it is to get from Louisiana. And so the use of tariffs is not really helpful when it comes to ensuring that we have a really strong and viable industry, and it will impact us. But what's interesting about propane is in about 2018, 100% of our exports went to the US. And then we built some terminals on the West Coast, and now about 40% go to Asia. So when we talk about diversifying markets, I was actually in Japan talking about this. Propane is your story, right? This is that positive story of how we went from 100% to the US to only 60% in the course of about 5 years.
Okay. David, to you, for the steel producing sector in Canada, maybe explain a little bit about what it is, how it works, and its kind of integration with the North American economy.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks again for having me here and for organizing this really interesting panel. The CSPA, the Canadian Steel Producers Association, we represent a $20 billion a year sector. Steel is, of course, vital to national security. It's vital to infrastructure development, and it's vital to growth. And indeed, it's vital to the Canadian economy. But I think one of the points I want to make during this discussion is that Canada's steel sector is also really important to the U.S. economy as well. So Canada and the U.S., we're each other's top steel trading partners. Annually, we see about $18 billion in traffic of steel between our two countries. Over 50% of Canadian steel production, which is about 6.5 million metric tons, is exported to the U.S. annually. And in Canada, over a quarter of Canadian steel consumption comes from the US, which is about $7 billion in US exports to Canada. So we really do have a mutually beneficial relationship with our colleagues and friends south of the border. And it's a relationship that underpins other critical sectors of our economy as well, including automotive, which is also recently in the tariff crosshairs. Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that we would like to see going forward from the steel sector's perspective is obviously for this current trade dispute to be put to bed. I mean, the last thing businesses want, whether in Canada or the States, are tariffs and a lack of policy certainty. And right now we have both. Right. So what we're looking for is to put this to bed, to have greater collaboration with the states on critical files that are impacting North American steel production. And what we've been wrestling with for years prior to tariffs coming into play, both in 2018 and in 2025, is jurisdictions like China supporting unfair trade practices and supporting global steel overcapacity. These are the core issues that are impacting North American steel production, both in Canada and the States, not trade between two allies that share a border. So that's a bit of a preamble for I think some of the discussions we're going to have later on.
Well, I'd like to. So both the propane sector and steel, both are sectors that have been, very mindful of the climate imperative. Have developed, I think, pretty robust plans for decarbonization. David, talk a little bit about steel's where decarbonization fits in the steel story in Canada, and also maybe talk a little bit about where propane fits into that story. Or not propane, sorry, where hydrogen fits into that story.
Sure. So in terms of the emissions profile for steel in Canada, we are accountable for about 15 megatons of CO2 equivalent a year, which is roughly 2% of Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of plant type, Canada has about 10, we have 10 mini mill plants and 3 integrated plants, largely based in Ontario, but we have producers in other provinces as well. Integrated plants, which use basically coal, emit 90% of steel emissions in Canada. So a key focus of our decarbonization pathway is on that integrated side of the equation. And there's three key pillars of our decarbonization pathway here. We have electrification, which is basically converting integrated coal-fired plants to electric arc furnaces. We have carbon capture and storage, basically capturing CO2 emissions from various processes and storing carbon. And then we have hydrogen as our third decarbonization pillar, which is basically used to replace coal in integrated production methods. Now, all of these pathways have challenges, both in terms of cost and in terms of infrastructure. But with hydrogen, I think we see a lot of potential here. Dofasco, of course, had a huge announcement in 2021 in terms of developing a hydrogen-ready direct reduced iron process on their site, which once operational can reduce their emissions profile by 3 megatons, which is substantial. Again, the total emissions profile for the sector is 15 megatons. So that one switch to hydrogen there is pretty material for the sector's overall emissions footprint. But what we need to kind of move forward with hydrogen integration in steel is, of course, a reduction in cost.
Yeah, you need a lot. You need a lot of hydrogen at a lower cost. Like a real lot of hydrogen,
and we need a lower cost. But one of the things I want to make clear here is that we could be a primary consumer of hydrogen, but we're not the only consumer. So to reach economies of scale, to reduce those cost structures, we would need other sectors, cement, pulp and paper, chemicals, other material sectors, to come on board and establish regional hydrogen hubs. And in a recent report we made with the Transition Accelerator, we found that a hydrogen facility the size of Dofasco's in southwestern Ontario would need about 500 tons of hydrogen a day. But the potential hydrogen demand in southwestern Ontario is 6,500 tons of hydrogen a day. So we need to work together with other industries to establish these consumer demands and build up the required infrastructure to make hydrogen economically feasible.
I've got one eye on the clock, but I did want to, Shannon, so I would like you to talk a little bit about the propane industry's around hydrogen, your decarbonization strategy and where hydrogen fits in. David's talking about, the steel being a potential major consumer. I think it's possible that the propane industry could be, maybe not at the same scale, but could be an important customer for hydrogen as well as maybe a partner for hydrogen.
Yeah, so we issued our decarbonization paper last spring, so almost a year ago, and it gave us 13 different pathways. Since then, we talked the talk and now we're walking the walk. We've had 3 announcements about decarbonizing propane. We have looked at hydrogen, so absolutely 100% looked into this, and it's complicated, unfortunately. So you can't hydrogen pack propane the way you can with natural gas. The pressure differential is just too great. And so instead what you have is you can have 2 canisters, one hydrogen and one propane, going to the same location and be used in that way. You also can put hydrogen in propane canisters. So using the infrastructure, you can use that hydrogen and move it around. You have to change out the valves. The problem is it's only 1/20th the energy value at the pressures of those propane tanks. And so there's not a lot of support on that side. But what is interesting is we have a pilot project going on in Chile where they have taken green hydrogen, they do carbon capture of CO2, and they make propane, and they actually transport hydrogen via propane. I need to put a plug and say propane's a pretty incredible molecule. It doesn't have the greenhouse gas emissions in terms of like methane. If it spills, it volatilizes, so it doesn't impact, and it can store for a long time. And so it makes it really easy to ship internationally. And so that is one route that we're looking at. Hydrogen is being used as sort of a backbone to transport it.
Let's bring the discussion back to the trade and tariff war, and Lisa and Alex, you'll chime in here as well, and maybe to you, Lisa. So we have these industries that could be major drivers for hydrogen. What is the impact on, what do you think the impact is in the near term or even possibly medium term on sustainable energy growth generally and hydrogen in particular as it relates to this trade war? I mean, is this really going to be, is this a stall, or is this a potential undoing of the potential?
I mean, my personal view, I think it's harmful in the sense that, well, actually, I'm going to refer to, there is a World Trade Organization article that was developed jointly with the International Renewable Energy Agency in 2023. It was all about international trade and green hydrogen. And it sort of highlighted the need to, at this time, as we have burgeoning growth in the industry, to be implementing supportive open trade policies to help spur investment, help spur growth. And certainly we've seen countries like India back in October talk about they're examining reductions in tariffs for machinery and equipment necessary to produce green hydrogen, and lowering goods and services tax on fuel outputs. And so we have some countries like India looking to become a more favorable sort of place for investment. But as we look to our own neighbor, I mean, these policies are extremely detrimental and likely to curb sort of cross-border investments and free-flowing trade that will ultimately increase costs.
David, is this trade war is the steel industry rethinking its decarbonization strategy because of this trade war?
So I think decarbonization remains a central focus for the steel sector. That hasn't changed. But if we're going to continue attracting investment in both production and decarbonization, we need to resolve this trade dispute pretty quickly. The reality is prolonged tariffs and uncertainty create hesitation for investors. And if companies don't have stable access to their largest export market, they're going to be more cautious about committing billions to long-term low carbon projects. So yeah, there's a real risk that the trade war can slow decarbonization efforts in the short term. But I think the silver lining here, and I'll try to be optimistic as much as I can during this discussion, I think history gives us some hope here. So again, after the 2018 tariffs, we saw major investment announcements in 2021 from both Algoma and Dofasco. So I think the takeaway here is that once stability is restored, and who knows how long that will be, investment will return. And the CSPA and our members remain committed to decarbonization. It's one of our central areas of focus, and we'll continue to invest in R&D and deployment as the years go by. So,
Shannon, what do you think the trade war impact it has on propane's decarbonization aspirations?
Oof. Honestly, a little bit of an impact. Definitely an impact in terms of the fact that a lot of our renewable propane comes from the States, but we're starting to see that within Canada, people are wanting to make renewable propane. Now it's a matter of getting the government's attention because we don't get captured in any of the biofuel regulations or supports. We're not like hydrogen. In terms of things that come first to mind, but we are trying to push for renewable propane. The one thing, thinking of trade war, if we're thinking President Trump, surprisingly, he's supportive of propane and he's supportive of biofuels. And so, yes, tariffs aside, there might actually be some opportunities. And that's sort of interesting. And we've been trying to reframe our thinking of, okay, what's beyond the next 3.5 to 4 years, and make sure that we're leading to that direction and not reacting in the moment. But we have a bit more wiggle room than, say, other industries.
So the big question is like how long and how deep this is going, Alex. And maybe I'll stop there, Attorney. If you wanted to, if people have questions, now might be the moment. Maybe you've already done it and I didn't even see it. But if people have questions, they can ask us, and I will try to ask them. But maybe first to you, Alex. So how deep, how long? What is your sense based on what we've been hearing? Is there any optimism that this could be resolved quickly, or are we really having to hunker down for the long term?
I would love.
And if you can answer this question, you will be very, very popular person. But
I would love to be optimistic, and I think unfortunately I cannot be. I would say, look. I really think that the goal here, and if you really listen to the Trump administration, this is the goal. It's a permanent state of uncertainty that they're trying to project. Whether things get walked back, whether there's some sort of finality in parts, that's entirely possible from an optimistic point of view. But I really think if you truly listen to this, It's about permanently onshoring jobs into the States. It's about drill, baby, drill in terms of like a viewpoint in terms of the energy sector. And so that might be favorable in parts to some folks. And look, people will innovate and find ways to get through this, but it's sort of hard for those of us who need that stability to look at the future as a very promising one, at least for the remainder of this mandate. But as American politics go, anything can happen. The midterms could bring a democratic renewal, and we might be having a very different conversation a couple of years from now.
So now I've figured out I had to open up the Q&A section, and there are some questions. So I will ask them. Lisa, I think the first one would be for you. Are the battery materials such as the cathode active materials to be produced in Canada and used in EV batteries also subject to tariffs? Skill testing question right off the bat. Oh, you're on mute.
Yep, I got it. Thanks. The short answer would be yes if it's a product of Canada. So first test is it a product of Canada, and the US applies 2 sets of origin rules to determine that, marking rules under the free trade agreement or substantial transformation. And then I guess the next question is whether the lower 10% rate, which also applies to certain critical minerals, applies versus the broader 25% rate.
Okay. Thank you. Another question for you, probably you, Lisa, but also David, you might have a view on this. What about transshipment of steel via Canada, that is steel produced elsewhere, brought into Canada and then exported to the USA? Is that a big problem? And maybe does the problem extend to foreign steel being then put in Canadian manufactured goods? David, do you have a view on that?
I don't know if steel being brought into Canada and then being exported to the US is a significant problem. I think our focus is, on anti-circumvention. So steel from jurisdictions like China that do have tariffs applied to them being sent to jurisdictions like Vietnam, and then from Vietnam being shipped into North American steel markets. That would be our focus. I don't think that this issue in the chat is material here.
Okay, Lisa. Transship steel is still subject to tariff?
Yeah, so I actually gave a written response, but transship
Oh, sorry.
steel through Canada, I gave a lengthy response in the chat, but basically saying that when it's going through Canada, the US, I mean, there's steel tariffs imposed on all countries by the US. So coming through Canada, you're going to be hit with a tariff. The additional complexities are you also hit with a tariff on the way into Canada, such as on Chinese origin steel? Unless it stays in bond, you would be, and then you'd have to deal with how to get it back on re-export. And if you further process it in Canada, an interesting nuance that we've come across is you might actually trip multiple tariffs based on multiple countries of origin. Simple example is if I import steel for simple assembly into something in Canada, it might be a product of Canada under the marking rules, but still be a product of China under the substantial transformation rules. And thus we have tariffs, IEEPA tariffs on, and steel tariffs on Canada origin as well as China origin. So you have multiple tariffs in that scenario.
Okay. There's another question, but I did want to maybe, Alex touched on this in his presentation, and I said we would come back to it, but I'm wondering if people have thoughts on the dynamics of the federal election. So we have two parties that seem to have a shot at forming the next government, the Liberals and the Conservatives. Any thoughts? People have thoughts on any implications if one party wins over the other? And I'm not asking people to have sort of partisan comments. So for example, like we know that the Conservative Party historically and more recently the Conservative caucus, when the Canadian Hydrogen Association went to Ottawa last fall, there was a lot of enthusiasm for hydrogen. So it was something that the caucus quite embraced. So I think the industry has a sense that a conservative government would be motivated to want to support the further growth of the hydrogen space. But now, as Alex said, the Liberals as well have commented on where hydrogen might fit in their plans. But do you guys have a thought on pros and cons of one party succeeding over the other? David, you want to take a crack at that
Maybe
one?
I'll jump on that grenade first.
For the rest of us, thank you.
So the boilerplate response to kind of set the table here. CSPA is nonpartisan. We're working with all parties on addressing the tariff issue right now, and thankfully, all of the major parties that we're speaking with recognize how material the current situation is. And I think we do have, despite being in a federal election, we do have a Team Canada approach to the current trade situation, which is great. I think when it comes to decarbonization, and the elephant in the room, of course, pertains to industrial carbon tax. The Conservatives, of course, just recently announced that they would scrap the federal backstop and leave provinces to manage that. Now, whether that means provinces would maintain industrial carbon tax or whether provinces would scrap industrial carbon tax, who knows? But I mean, that's a level of uncertainty that has to be resolved. And, I think that there's a lot of navel gazing right now on what a lack of a federal backstop would mean for green infrastructure investments, for continued decarbonization investments within industry, and so on and so forth. And within the steel sector, we're still grappling with that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we do face material costs under the federal OBPS and provincial counterparts. But at the same time, some of these tax vehicles do have reinvestment programs, both in Ontario, Alberta, and so on and so forth. So we do see material benefits in reinvesting money we put into the carbon tax back into green infrastructure projects within our operations. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And again, if there's a theme of this call, there's uncertainty abound here, and that spills over to the federal election.
We're running very short on time. Shannon, I'm going to give you the last word on this question.
Super quick.
Yeah.
So all I would say is this new environment, industry used to be the villain for the Conservatives, for the Liberals, for everybody. And now we're not. Now we're seen as economic drivers, as important contributors, the whole works. And so it doesn't matter which party goes in. I'm hopeful that they'll be coming to us and working with us instead of making regulatory decisions without us.
That's great. Alex, final last word to you, and then Lisa, we'll finish with your final thoughts, closing thoughts.
I'm teaching a public policy class this week at McGill, and part of it is how do you drive public policy? And sometimes, as Churchill said, events, dear boy, events. And this is that event. And I just love what Shannon said about it. The shift in Canada is something we obviously saw in the pandemic, but this is on a whole other level of when Prime Minister Carney says he met with all of his counterparts of all political stripes, and we're going to solve Canada internal trade by July 1. And no premier came out and said any different, that there will be an energy corridor through Quebec. This is an incredible moment. And I really believe that regardless of the political party that prevails on April 28th, we're going to be begging industry to bring us to a safer ground. So thank you for that, and thanks to all my co-panelists. This has been fascinating to listen to.
Lisa, you get the final word.
Yes, I would say to the comments at the outset about nobody knows how long this is going to on, but in discussions with senior trade officials in the federal government, I think what I've gleaned is it's likely to be, and they're planning for at least a 12 to 18 month sort of pain period for tariffs. And so that's not a short duration. There is lots of things we've discussed, including at the outset, Alex mentioned remission programs, public comment periods on surtax, leveraging associations to get in front of government to make your views heard, I think is important, because I don't think we're in for just a couple of weeks or a couple of months. I think we're in for a little longer.
Okay, well, with that, we'll wrap this webinar. I do want to thank a great panel. So Lisa Zatko, Shannon Watt, David Bilodeau, Alex Steinhaus, thank you so much for participating in this. To people who have sat through the webinar, who asked questions, we're grateful for your participation. And so on behalf of the CHA, thank you very much for joining today, and we look forward to speaking to you again at a future CHA webinar.